In recent months, the Caribbean Sea has become a mounting focal point for U.S. military operations that are reshaping geopolitical dynamics in the Western Hemisphere. The United States is reinforcing its presence across the region with a suite of warships, aircraft, special operations platforms and troops, a deployment described by analysts as the largest U.S. military buildup in the region since the Cold War era. The publicly stated mission for Washington is to suppress the flow of illicit narcotics through the Caribbean. The U.S. government characterizes the deployment as a counter-drug initiative, targeting what it calls narco-terrorist groups and maritime traffickers. But independent analysts and regional capitals increasingly question whether the full agenda may extend beyond interdiction, pointing instead to a potential aim of regime change pressure on the neighboring government of Venezuela. To understand the significance of the moment, let's survey the key players and stakes, then reconstruct the unfolding chain of events, and finally assess what lies ahead. The United States is under the leadership of President Donald Trump. He remains in the White House and has directed the expanded deployment to the Caribbean. The government of Nicolás Maduro remains in power in Venezuela. He continues as president and has publicly accused the U.S. of seeking to force a regime change through military means. One of the analysts widely cited in this space is Patrick Duddy, a former U.S. ambassador to Venezuela 2007 to 2010 and senior advisor for global affairs at Duke University. He argues that the U.S. buildup suggests objectives beyond counter-narcotics. The Colombian government, led by President Gustavo Petro, has expressed sharp concern about the escalated U.S. operations in the Caribbean, including reports of Colombian casualties in U.S. strikes. Since early September 2025, the U.S. has ramped up military activity in the southern Caribbean region. According to a report by the Quincy Institute, more than a dozen large warships are deployed, along with over 10,000 U.S. personnel and a full carrier strike force representing the region's largest U.S. buildup since the Cuban Missile Crisis era. A detailed investigation by Reuters revealed that the U.S. is refurbishing a long-abandoned Cold War-era naval base in the Caribbean to serve as a staging ground for operations. The positioning includes advanced maritime assets equipped with land strike capability, drones and fighter jets, assets whose deployment exceeds what would normally be justified solely for maritime narcotics interdiction. U.S. officials publicly assert the mission is anti-drug trafficking. For example, Ambassador Patrick Duddy writes that some senior U.S. voices emphasize that drug abuse in the United States remains at epidemic levels despite decades of efforts to control it, and that the cartels smuggling drugs into the U.S. The administration contends that Venezuela is the country from which much of the illicit boat and air traffic carrying cocaine emanates, and that Venezuela's longtime strongman is really the head of a cartel and a fugitive from American justice. Yet the scale and nature of the deployment raise questions. The assets in use, nuclear-powered aircraft carrier strike groups, Tomahawk-capable ships, thousands of Marines appear mismatched to the stated mission of chasing fast boats and coastal smuggling networks. Several analysts conclude that the buildup may serve a dual purpose, applying military and geopolitical pressure on Venezuela's leadership. Venezuelan President Maduro, for his part, has said they are seeking a regime change through military threat and further warned Venezuela is confronting the biggest threat that has been seen on our continent in 1990, the last 100 years. His government has mobilized forces, held public military maneuvers, and issued warnings of defending national sovereignty against what it calls U.S. gunboat diplomacy. The New York Times, among others, reports weakened Venezuelan military capabilities, but stressed that the optics of confrontation are real. Several specific incidents have sharpened the debate. On 2 September, the U.S. military publicly acknowledged striking a vessel allegedly departing from Venezuela and carrying drugs, killing 11 people. Colombia's President Gustavo Petro has accused the U.S. of killing Colombian citizens in these strikes, declaring a new theatre of war has opened up the Caribbean. He also claimed the attacks were not merely about narcotics, but also about oil, pointing to Venezuela's hydrocarbon reserves. In early September, the US deployed its newest carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, along with its strike group into the Caribbean region, significantly elevating the profile of the mission. These moves have triggered strong reactions across Latin America. The community of Latin American and Caribbean states convened an extraordinary meeting in Caribbean September 2025 and issued a statement declaring deep concern over external military deployment. It reaffirmed the region should remain a zone of peace and stressed the prohibition of the use or threat of force in intra-regional affairs. Ambassador Patrick Duddy argues that while the US mission superficially targets drug cartels, the strategic overlay points to something more. He asks, is the US administration contemplating military strikes inside of Venezuela? If so, how extensively? He notes that the size and posture of the deployed forces makes speculation about regime change inevitable. Another commentary from the National Interest contends that the US build-up may not definitively indicate a commitment to regime change, but that the scale of the deployment invites such speculation. In short, the question is no longer whether the US is building for counter-narcotics, but to what end, and whether one of those aims is political pressure aimed at the Maduro government. The underlying logic, if Venezuela's revenues from trafficking decline, thus undercutting the loyalty of senior military and police commanders allegedly complicit in the trade, is the US applying economic and military coercion to engineer a change in leadership or alignment. While the US has long maintained a presence in the Caribbean, this escalation marks a departure. The build-up has included forward operating locations on Dutch territories, Aruba, Curaçao and Radar, technical staff requests in Grenada. Some Caribbean nations have welcomed the US presence, while others have protested, calling it an infringement on sovereignty. On 8 September, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Air Force General Daniel Kane made a surprise visit to Puerto Rico, where hundreds of US Marines were deployed in what officials described as training, but Hegseth said was not training. This is the real-world exercise on behalf of the vital national interest of the United States of America to end the poisoning of the American people. Local protesters in Puerto Rico have expressed concerns over the perception of militarization, referencing past incidents such as the 1,999 Vieques bombing accident, while local government officials emphasized the strategic geography of the island. In Caracas, President Maduro has doubled down on his narrative of external threat. At a press conference, he said that the US is seeking a regime change in his country with a naval deployment in the Caribbean, describing the deployment as the gravest threat to the continent in a century. Venezuela has mobilized its armed forces, held Caribbean military exercises, and invoked memories of Cold War interventionism. Some analysts argue the Venezuelan military is underfunded and not a match for US firepower, but the symbolism of confrontation is powerful. The escalation has spurred wider regional concern. Colombia, Grenada, and other Caribbean states are assessing requests for US radar or installations, weighing sovereignty concerns against security cooperation. The broader message, the Caribbean may be evolving into a potential zone of great power competition once again. The following reconstructs the substance of the original video transcript in journalistic form. An analyst contended that the US is pursuing regime change on the cheap through the Caribbean deployment. The argument is that by using military pressure, naval deployments and strikes under the anti-narcotics guise, the US aims to destabilise the Venezuelan leadership without committing to a full-scale invasion. The term on the cheap implies minimal US casualties, no massive ground force commitments, and a reliance instead on maritime and air power plus political economic coercion. The script observed that the volume of US assets, carrier strike groups, Marines, advanced jets, drones far surpasses what is needed for routine counter-narcotics missions in the Caribbean. It said this discrepancy opens up plausible reading of a dual purpose. The analyst highlighted that Venezuela's senior military and security apparatus derives significant revenue from narco-trafficking. Therefore, by disrupting maritime routes, sinking vessels and freezing assets, the US may hope to undercut the regime's base of support. The narrative goes, once funding and loyalty among the Venezuelan military elite are eroded, the regime becomes vulnerable to internal fracturing. It was further argued that the US is using the Caribbean staging ground to send a message to extra-regional actors, Russia, China, Iran, that the Western Hemisphere remains a US strategic priority. The heightened naval presence, allied exercises and forward staging in Puerto Rico and islands serves both regional deterrence and signalling. The transcript quoted the Venezuelan leadership, reinforced by the presence of military brass at the podium. Venezuela is confronting the biggest threat that has been seen on our continent in the last 100 years. The analyst interpreted that line as an indicator that Caracas sees the deployment not only as a counter-trafficking measure, but as existential. Moreover, the analyst flagged that the US may be engaging in so-called grey zone operations, strikes at sea, special ops and
intelligence pressure, all short of a full invasion. By keeping the footprint limited but visible, the US hopes to compel regime behavior without triggering full-scale war.
The transcript further offered caution. Even if regime change is not the explicit public mission, the build-up creates space for escalation. Were the US to strike land-based targets in Venezuela or align with an opposition government, the threshold for direct intervention would be crossed. Finally, the analyst noted the risk of unintended consequences, regional backlash, legal questions about US maritime strikes, potential escalation with Venezuela's allies, and erosion of US soft power credibility in Latin America. The transcript warned that the optics of gunboat diplomacy could rebound against US interests, even if narrowly targeted. The current deployment affirms that the Caribbean has become an arena not only for drug trafficking interdiction, but for broader strategic competition. The presence of the USS Gerald R. Ford Strike Group, advanced drones, F-35 jets and forward bases signals a step change in US posture in the hemisphere. If indeed the US objective is to weaken the Maduro regime and reduce its influence, the strategy appears to revolve around leveraging maritime pressure to erode illicit revenue streams, degrade military loyalty, and push Caracas into political concession. But that strategy carries risk. Venezuela could seek counter-alliances with Russia or China. Regional partners may push back, and undisclosed casualties or incidents could trigger wider crisis. The involvement of Colombia's President Petro underscores how vulnerable adjacent states feel about the US approach. His claim that the war in the Caribbean is less about drugs and more about oil indicates a broader regional interpretation of US intent. Moreover, US operations that extend into grey zone strikes or pressure on Venezuelan soil raise significant legal, diplomatic and military questions. Whether the rules of engagement and international law frameworks are in place remains subject to debate. In sum, what began as a campaign pitched as counter-narcotics has escalated into a far larger strategic gambit. The Caribbean, long a peripheral theatre, is now at the heart of US hemispheric ambition and of Venezuelan sovereignty fears. The phrase used by the analyst, regime change on the cheap, encapsulates what is being described, a strategy that seeks maximal leverage with limited visible cost. For Caracas, the build-up is existential. For Washington, it is an opportunity to reassert dominance in its near abroad. For the region, it is a moment of perilous ambiguity. Is this a legitimate counter-drug mission or an interventionist posture discreetly aimed at toppling a neighbour? The coming months will test whether the US will keep its footprint naval and aerial or cross the threshold into direct land-based operations. Meanwhile, Latin America will watch closely, questioning whether sovereignty, diplomacy and regional norms can endure in the face of such a display of force.